There are questions that don't appear when life is still calm. They rise only when everything collapses at once, when a person falls to their knees in the ruins of their own life and realizes that the most terrifying thing is not loss, but silence. Not thunder, not punishment, not tears, but the moment you cry out to heaven and receive no answer at all. Have you ever been there? When prayer becomes a monologue, when the faith that once held you up suddenly feels so fragile that a single breath could shatter it. The story of Job begins exactly there, not with wealth, not with blessings, but with the cold emptiness between a human being and God. Job does not enter history as an unbeliever who later gets converted, nor is he a sinner being punished. He is an upright man, one who fears God, living a quietly righteous life with steady integrity. And precisely because of that, when disaster strikes, Job's tragedy becomes more brutal than most, because his suffering is not only the loss of what he loved, but the loss of the sense that God is near. Everything that once carried meaning, prayer, sacrifice, loyalty, suddenly produces no echo from above. And in that silence, a frightening question forms. If God does not speak when the righteous cry out, then what is faith truly built on? That silence does not arrive in a single instant. It lingers, heavy, sealed like a sky that will not open. Job receives no warning, no explanation, no reassurance, no angel appears, no whispered promise, no sign that this is a test. All he feels is distance, distance between heaven and earth, between pleading and cruel reality, between a faith that once felt solid and a feeling of abandonment. This is where faith stops being a concept and becomes a life or death struggle inside the soul. Many people think faith collapses when you lose everything. But the truth is harsher. Faith collapses when you are no longer sure God is listening. Job still prays, but prayer no longer comforts. He remains faithful, but that faithfulness receives no response. And this is where Job's story breaks away from familiar moral tales. This is no longer a story of believe and you'll be rewarded. It is the story of believing when there is nothing left to hold on to. At this point, Job does not argue, revolt, or walk away. He does not turn suffering into proof against God, but he also does not deceive himself by pretending everything is fine. He stays in the darkness. He carries a question with no answer. He lives in the paradox of faith, revering God while not understanding his silence. And that staying, no running, no denial, no performative strength, is what makes Job's story one of the deepest tests of faith ever told. Welcome to La Prophetic History Explained, where we enter prophetic stories not to chase easy answers but to face the hardest questions faith can ask. If you have ever felt God's silence in your life, if you have ever been confused between prayer and reality, then this story is not appearing in front of you by accident. And right now, if you feel this is touching something deep inside you, subscribe to Prophetic History Explained. To support us in continuing to make videos that dig into prophetic history, faith, and the questions many people are afraid to face. Your support is not just a subscription, it is your way of walking with us in the search for meaning in the dark. Job's story will not end with silence, but before light appears, a person must learn how to stand in the night without running. And here, at this beginning, the real question is no longer, where is God? But will you still dare to believe when you can no longer hear his voice? This is where faith is tested to its limit, and where the story begins to lead us toward an ending no one could predict. There is a quiet but common illusion in religious life, that the righteous will be protected from suffering. From that illusion, people build a dangerous framework where blessing becomes proof of righteousness and disaster becomes evidence of sin. Job's story shatters that entire way of thinking at its foundation. He is not righteous because he is blessed. Rather, precisely because he is righteous, the trial becomes so severe. Job's suffering does not disprove his faith. It forces that faith to reveal its true nature. Job lived uprightly long before tragedy came. No one forced him to fear God. No one supervised his loyalty. He lived a moral life in silence where reverence was not a transaction for reward, but a way of existing before God. And so when everything collapses, Job is not crushed simply by loss, but by a deeper question. If righteousness does not protect you from suffering, does righteousness still mean anything? What makes Job different is not that he suffers, but that he refuses to let suffering redefine his faith. When he loses everything, he does not declare God a failure, nor conclude that righteousness is pointless. He does not treat faith like a broken contract. In the moment when walking away would seem most reasonable, he chooses to remain, not because he feels no pain, but because he grasps a hard truth. Faith was never a tool for controlling the outcome of life. Some believe because they are being given. Some remain loyal because things are still fine. But Job reveals another kind of faith, rare, unsettling, and far more difficult. Faith that does not require immediate evidence. When he says that everything he had came from God and could also be taken away, this is not religious language. It is the ego surrendering. He accepts that human beings do not truly own anything absolutely, not even the most precious things in their lives. And that acceptance strips suffering of its greatest power, the power to turn a person bitter. Job's faith is not measured by how many prayers are answered, but by his refusal to assign God motives according to human logic. He does not say God owes him an explanation. He does not treat righteousness as a shield that guarantees safety. He understands, without needing to say it, that faith is not a promise of a safe life, but a relationship with a Lord beyond human control. Here, Job is not weak. He is strong enough not to reduce God into a tool for personal notions of fairness. That kind of faith is difficult for many to accept, because it does not promise a comfortable ending. It does not say, if you live well, you will avoid tragedy. It says only something simple and severe. You can live righteously and still suffer. And in that paradox, faith is refined, not conditional faith, but faith that survives even when conditions collapse. Job does not boast about his righteousness. He does not use it to demand rights. He does not hold it up as evidence to force God to act as he wishes. For Job, righteousness is not a medal. It is a way of being. And when that way of being is tested to the limit, he does not change himself to adapt to suffering. He does not trade reverence for cheap comfort. He does not repeat hollow moral cliches to numb himself. He stays with the raw truth of pain without abandoning his relationship with God. Here, Job's story gives today's listener a sharp challenge. In a world where faith is often tied to success, safety, and stability, Job asks, if all of that disappears, what do you still have? If your faith no longer brings tangible benefits, will you keep it or drop it? Job's faith does not prevent suffering. It prevents him from losing himself inside suffering. That is why Job is not the model of a person who never breaks. He is the model of a person who does not betray what he believes, even when belief offers no visible protection. Righteousness does not save him from tragedy, but it keeps him from becoming someone else. And sometimes that is the greatest victory faith can give. When someone reaches the deepest point of suffering, what they need most is not an explanation but presence. Not the correct answer, but a heart close enough not to turn pain into something that must be justified. And here Job's story moves into another layer of tragedy. A tragedy not caused by disaster, illness, or loss, but by people who speak for God. Job's 3 friends are not evil men. They do not come to mock him or publicly condemn him. They come out of friendship, duty and the belief that they can help him understand what is happening. At first, they do the one right thing. They sit down, remain silent, and weep with him. For 7 days, they say nothing because before pain, that great words become violent. But the moment they begin to speak, comfort becomes a wound. They believe they are defending God's justice. They believe that if suffering exists, it must have a moral cause. For them, the world's order is simple. The righteous are blessed, the wicked are punished. And if that order appears broken, it cannot be God who is wrong. It must be the human being hiding sin. From that belief, they start reasoning, analyzing, hypothesizing, and concluding, not from evidence, but from a system already locked inside their minds. The danger is this. They do not speak things that are entirely false. They speak of God's justice, holiness, the consequences of sin, words familiar in religious language. But they speak true things at the wrong time for the wrong purpose and without mercy. Truth detached from love does not heal. It becomes a weapon. And speech without empathy does not lift a person. It crushes them. Job is not only suffering physically, he also endures the most painful kind of misunderstanding, being treated like a hypocrite. Those who once respected him now look at him with suspicion. Those who once saw him as a model now imply he has hidden sin. This pain can be worse than illness because it steals the last thing a suffering person still has: dignity. When suffering is labeled as guilt, the sufferer is not only hurt, they are isolated. Job's friends do not realize that in trying to defend the image of a just God as they understand him, they turn God into a cold, unfeeling judge. They leave no room for mystery. They cannot accept that there are realities beyond human explanation. And so they fill the silence with judgment. They cannot tolerate uncertainty, so they choose certainty, even when that certainty wounds someone already shattered. Job's response is not to deny God, but to reject the way people are speaking about him. He refuses a God reduced to simple logic and moral formulas. He dares to say his pain cannot be collapsed into a neat moral lesson. He dares to hold on to inner honesty, even when that honesty makes him seem stubborn or disrespectful. In Job's world, speaking honestly to God is more faithful than repeating correct phrases with a dead heart. This is the terrifying depth of this section. Human beings can cause each other the greatest pain not through violence, but through the confidence that they are speaking for God. When someone believes they fully understand God's intentions, they stop listening to the one who is hurting. They stop questioning. They stop being humble. And faith becomes a closed system with no room for tears, weakness, or unanswered questions. Job does not need his friends to explain why he suffers. He needs them to stay, but they cannot endure that silence. They need an explanation so they can reassure themselves that the world still works the way they want it to. And to protect their own sense of safety, they sacrifice the feelings of the man collapsing in front of them. This is the deepest tragedy here. Sometimes people harm others not out of malice, but because they cannot face the fragility of their own faith. This part of Job is not just an ancient religious story. It is a mirror of modern society where people quickly judge others' pain, label it, offer conclusions and advice rather than listen. It asks an uncomfortable question. When we face another person's suffering, are we truly accompanying them, or are we protecting beliefs that make us feel safe? Job's friends think they are on God's side, but later God himself will say they did not speak rightly about him. Because speaking rightly about God is not only about accurate statements, it is about speaking with a heart that trembles before human pain. And when mercy is missing, every word, even religious words, can become a burden no one can carry. There comes a moment in the journey of faith when questions become pointless. Not because they have been answered, but because you suddenly realize you were asking the wrong thing from the start. The climax of Job does not arrive when the pain peaks, nor when arguments run out, but when God speaks. Yet what shocks most is not what God says, but what he does not do. God does not appear to defend Job or to defeat his friends. He does not recount what happened in heaven. He does not explain why the trial occurred. He does not untie every knot of logic humans tried to build. When God speaks, the atmosphere changes completely. This is no longer a human debate or a desperate monologue. This is a human being standing before the one beyond every framework of thought. God does not answer, "Why am I suffering?" Instead, he asks something deeper. Who are you? Not to humiliate Job, but to pull him away from the most dangerous position a human can take, the position of demanding God give an account. When God speaks of the earth's foundations, the sea's boundaries, light and darkness, he is not boasting to crush Job. He is opening a vast vision that forces Job to face the limits of his own mind. Here, the issue is no longer justice in a narrow sense. God does not deny Job's pain nor the honesty of his cry. But he places that pain inside a far larger picture, one in which the universe does not revolve around one person's suffering, even if that person is righteous. Not to make pain small, but to free the human being from the illusion that everything must be explained according to human standards. The images of Behemoth and Leviathan are not meant to terrify, but to awaken a hard truth. There are realities beyond human control, beyond taming, beyond explanation. If you cannot govern what God has created, how can you demand to govern how he runs justice? In that moment, Job is not condemned for suffering. He is challenged for trying to fit God into a moral frame he built himself. And importantly, God does not say Job is wrong for lamenting. He does not demand that Job be silent and endure. He does one decisive thing. He places Job back into the proper position of a creature. And when Job sees that, his questions begin to dissolve. Not because they were answered, but because they no longer hold power. The thirst for explanation is replaced by a deeper recognition. God is not an object to interrogate, but the one to be known. When Job says that before he had only heard of God, but now his eyes have seen him, it marks a total inner transformation. This is not the surrender of a defeated man. It is the awakening of a person who has touched the final boundary of understanding. Job no longer needs vindication, no longer needs to prove his innocence, no longer needs to compare himself with others. He realizes that relationship with God is not built on who is right or wrong, but on the truth that God is God, and the human being is human. This strikes deeply today. We live in a world addicted to explanations. Everything must have reasons, clarity, and logic. But when we apply that mindset to God, we quietly turn him into a system to test, evaluate, and approve. Job's story asks an uncomfortable question. Can you trust God even when you do not understand, cannot control, and are not given explanations? God does not come to make Job's pain reasonable. He comes to put Job back in the right place. And when a person stands in the right place, they no longer need answers in order to keep living. God's presence becomes more sufficient than any explanation. This is the turning point of Job. Faith is not saved by explanations, but by encounter. Job leaves that confrontation not with a logical solution, but with new sight. He does not understand more about the cause of suffering, but he understands more about God and about himself. And in that understanding, pain is no longer proof of abandonment. It becomes the place where faith is reborn. This is where faith stops resisting, stops demanding, and begins to trust in the deepest way a human being can. One truth is easily missed when Job's story reaches its end. The greatest change is not outside, but inside. Many people remember only that Job was restored, doubled, blessed with family and long life. But if we stop there, we miss the deepest gift of the story. Because if Job's greatest reward is wealth or children, then all the suffering becomes merely a transaction. Endure to be repaid. And faith is dragged back to the old model. Suffer to earn compensation. Job does not end that way. After encountering God, Job is no longer the same man, not because he learned more facts, but because he no longer needs understanding in the way he once demanded. Before, he lived righteously with sincere faith, but still carried a quiet expectation that righteousness would keep him safe in the world's order. After the storm of revelation, that expectation dissolves, not because it was immoral, but because it was too small for the reality of God. Job's faith enters a new stage, one no longer based on outcomes, no longer measured by what comes back. When Job is restored, the key is not how much he receives, but that he no longer clings to it. He does not treat restoration as proof that he was right and others were wrong. He does not use the happy ending to justify the pain. He walks into the new season with deeper humility than ever. The man who argued, cried out, and questioned now speaks less. His silence is no longer despair. It is the silence of someone who has found an anchor beyond words. Job's real reward is not getting back what he lost, but not needing those things to prove his faith anymore. His faith no longer has to defend itself in hardship. It no longer needs to justify itself before others' eyes. It stands free, and that freedom is the clearest sign of mature faith. Job no longer has to ask why, because he has learned how to live with the question without being crushed by it. This matters today. In a world where every story must end happily to be meaningful, Job reminds us that a good ending is not what gives suffering value. Suffering is not justified by reward. It is transformed by who you become as you come out of it. If Job were only remembered as the man who eventually got repaid, he would be just another moral example. But Job is remembered because he passed through suffering without letting it define him. When Job prays for the friends who wounded him, it is not a formal act of morality. It shows he has truly moved beyond the need to vindicate himself. Only when a person no longer needs to prove they are right can they pray for those who misunderstood them. That forgiveness does not come because everything is fine. It comes because Job has seen God as greater than personal injury. This is the leap of faith, the moment a human being is no longer the center of the story. So the ending of Job is not a promise that everyone who endures will be rewarded, but a deeper invitation. Are you willing to enter a faith that offers no guarantees? That faith does not promise everything will be okay, but it promises you will not lose yourself. It does not say God will always intervene the way you want, but it insists He is always present in the way you need, even if you do not recognize it. Job lives many more years, sees his descendants grow, and dies in peace. But that peace does not come because the past was compensated. It comes because he learned to remain in God's presence without conditions. This is the true ending. Faith is no longer the attempt to hold God. It is the willingness to be held by Him, even when you cannot see the road ahead. And when the story closes, what echoes is not restored wealth, but a human being matured by darkness. Job does not receive the answers he once sought, but he receives something greater, a relationship no longer built on reward or punishment. That is the ultimate reward, quiet, unshakable, and impossible for any loss to steal. The deepest lesson here is not about enduring better, but about trusting deeper. Trust is not blind acceptance of everything. It is staying with God even when you do not understand, cannot control, and are not reassured. In real life, when we face failure, illness, loss, or injustice, We often rush to find reasons, blame someone, or condemn ourselves. Job invites us to pause, to stop concluding too quickly, to stop speaking for God in judgment of ourselves or others, and to learn how to live honestly with pain without cutting off relationship with Him. Applied to life today, that means, when suffering comes, allow yourself to hurt, but do not let pain define your worth. When God feels silent, do not assume He has left you. And when you stand before someone else's suffering, be present before you speak, listen before you teach, love before you explain. That is how faith becomes living, human, and mature. If you want to keep going deeper into prophetic stories, timeless lessons of faith, and perspectives that help you understand the relationship between human beings and God, both in history and in modern life, join the Prophetic History Explained community. Here we explore prophets, biblical and Quranic narratives, and religious traditions through a thoughtful, humane, reflective lens. And don't forget to subscribe to Prophetic History Explained to support us in continuing to bring high-quality content, stories that touch the depths of faith and help people find meaning even in the darkest seasons of life.